open to timely advice from experts as we discuss all things leadership and technology. You'll get the inside scoop on better business practices, from making the most of your technology to leading a company with your head and heart. Pull up a seat with Marco CEO Jeff Gow and President Doug Albrechts. Let's tech.
All right, welcome back to Let's Tech. And we are very excited to be back, aren't we, Jeffrey?
Couldn't wait to be here. Good to see you live and in person again. Totally awesome.
It is awesome.
And we do have our, well, we're not matching that much.
Not today.
Yeah.
Not today, but we're going to talk about, I would say, the one single item, and I know you would agree because I know it keeps you up at night, but the one single item that keeps leaders from virtually all industries, all organizations, anybody that has any sort of information or IT infrastructure, it keeps them up at night. And I would have to say that that is security and the security threats that can come about any organization, really. And it's kind of scary.
Well, it's even a scary word. And you think about it, it's all the kind of stuff you hope happens to somebody else, right? And that's fine if it does, right? It's not good, but it's better than if it happens to you. And so I think what they fear is, under my watch, I certainly don't want to have a breach, or I don't want to have a compromise. That's something we don't want to go through. And so we do everything we can to avoid it. And we need to put ourselves in positions that don't make us susceptible to those kind of activities. Keep the bad guys out, right?
Yeah. And by the way, I mean, everybody can relate to this because it's something that happens on the home front, and not physical security, but of course IT security. For I know you have your dad is up there in age, part of the greatest generation. My dad is too, and he gets the emails that say, it started with you got a cousin over in Europe and send money to this location. We can get him out of jail, that type of thing.
And my dad sent the check. It was great.
Did he send it?
I got it. Yeah.
And my dad's gotten a bunch of these recently, and he calls me and he can't let it go. And I said, Dad, just delete the email. There's more to it than that. But it happens at home. But in the workplace, it's become an industry itself almost, right? And I think Marco's invested a ton of money, an amount of time and effort into mitigating risk and to prevent these issues. And it's important for us to do that. And like you said, it's fine until it happens to you.
Yeah, it's somebody else's problem until it's in your backyard, right?
We need to make sure that we're putting ourselves in the best position, but we also manage. We have a lot of customers that our responsibility is to manage their information and to keep them secure. And we have a bunch of leaders, but that focus on this, but one primarily, and we've got him here today. And do you remember how we said we were going to have experts that actually knew what they were talking about?
Well, the fact is, we know for sure he's the smartest guy in the room today, don't we?
That's right. That's
100%.
right.
It's usually you, right? But you take a step back today, and we're going to let Mike, have the guest seat. Right?
Yeah. Let me introduce. So Mike Burgard, and I get to introduce him because Mike works for me.
Well, all the important smart guys.
I know,
right? That way it makes you look smarter.
It makes me look a lot smarter, thank God. But he serves as the Marco Chief Information Security Officer. So in the hip world, for you kids out there, that's a CISO, right? He calls himself a business and technology integration evangelist because he really is, and he believes at the core of helping organizations understand the solutions to better position themselves in this world that's changing so dynamically. He does a really good job, Jeff. I think you'll agree with this. Every single day, he's talking about security and what's going on in the world and how we need to protect our organization and how we need to protect our clients. And we know he's doing a good job when he starts to annoy us with this. That's kind of the litmus test, right?
Well, there's a term we kind of use around Marco. When you get up in the morning thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
I'm trying to sell something, you're trying to strategize on it. He is all about security, isn't he? When he gets up in the morning, that's all he thinks about.
Yeah,
I'm glad he's doing that because if he didn't, we'd be thinking about it and probably the wrong way.
Yeah, and before he was our CISO, he served as the Director of Strategic Operations and Solutions Architect for Marco, and he's got everybody calls it, or people like to call it the alphabet soup, but really the A to Z of certifications and all things technology. I would like to introduce today Mike Burgard.
Welcome, Mike.
Hey, happy to be here.
We're glad you're here over the phone. This is the first time Jeff and I have had a guest, I believe, over the phone.
It is for sure. Yep.
So we're in new territory here. So security. So Mike, we're going to ask you a bunch of questions today, and we know security can be extraordinarily complicated. There are so many facets to it, and it evolves. It seemingly evolves every day. And you and I were talking the other day, and we were using analogies, and you're going to use one here in a second. But I kind of gave you mine, and I said, the irony of it is would you get on an airlines that just kind of didn't really take safety very seriously, and they just didn't do the checks, but they were, as a discount, as a good deal. But would you get on that airline? And I think most of us would say we wouldn't do that. And I often hear you talk about security, and you kind of say it's kind of like going to the dentist. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's right. So security it's a fun topic, right? There's a lot of ways that we can talk about it, but ultimately you've got to make it relatable. And I think the best way to do that is we put it in, we use analogies that people understand, things that we use in our daily lives. And everybody can relate going to the dentist. Everybody gets a cleaning. You do that once or twice a year. It's typically not a pleasant process, costs a lot of money. Your return on it is, somebody's brushing your teeth essentially for you. And we all know they do a little more than that. But the reason that we do it is it prevents other things, right?
Sure does. You don't want to get any cavities, right? So
we don't want cavities.
So Mike, we've seen a lot of organizations kind of get tested recently, and I hear these names of some of these that they give and identify these forms of ransomware and security breaches. They use the words like really scary ones like WannaCry and CryptoLocker, and what do you think what people would be most surprised to learn about these breaches? What kinds of things happen that you go, people would be surprised just how sneaky these people are?
Yeah, that's a great topic. I think ultimately most attacks, and we all know this part, but most attacks start through phishing. So it really is an end user or an employee clicking a link in an email. So PH phishing, so it's PHISH, right? We're not out on a boat catching any walleye today, but
right.
We're pivoting this one. So yeah, it's basically the bad actors or bad guys out there. They craft very authentic looking emails, and they'll send it to typically targeted employees. Sometimes they'll just send it to anybody they can get an address for, but we'll target. They'll go after certain folks in the organization, and they'll ask them to do something. And that's really the start. So what they ask for is typically, hey, give us your username and password. Sometimes it's send a wire or, send some money out to a different place. But they do a variety of things, and ultimately it comes down to, we're just going to send you an email that really isn't a good email, but it probably looks pretty legitimate.
And do people actually do this stuff? I mean, do they send money and things like that? Or, is it a good business for these people that are doing it?
Unfortunately it is. They do. So in 2019, the FBI had over $2 billion in financial loss that tied back to phishing reported to them. We know that's an artificially low number because in reality, most organizations don't report to the FBI. So, you think about that, $2 billion is a lot. And that's, you look at the number of incidents that had happened, it was over 100,000 unique incidents that led into that. So it's broad scale. It's happening everywhere. It's happening every day.
Do you have examples of that? Are there companies you know of, or maybe clients we have, or, people that that come to mind?
Yeah, we, unfortunately, we see typically an average of 3 phishing attacks that are generally successful to a degree happen every day. We've had the effects of that every day. We have at least, on average, 3 a day.
Wow.
We've seen the effects range from, a company might get ransomware as an effect out of that, which then leads to a whole set of things all in its own. Typical cost for that around, we've seen the average of that be around $50,000, and that's
ransomware like it sounds? Like they ask you for something, and if you don't do it, they're going to do something bad. Is that how that works?
In a nutshell, that is. They're preventing you access to your own data.
So bad would be
really what they're doing in ransomware.
bad would be how it relates to your network and denying you access unless you give them something. Is that kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think ransomware is something it's not new. It's been around for a while. One of the unique things that's happened in 2020 and specifically as we've navigated this pandemic is we've seen the exfiltration of data start to happen with ransomware now as well. So not only are they encrypting your data, but they're actually sending it out somewhere on top of it.
So, Mike, we've got 1 million, 2 million listeners out there, and I think this is the burning.
Well, it went down this week.
It went down slightly, and this is the burning question: is where do they get? So when someone sends an email to an HR department, and as an example, and it looks like the email has come from Jeff. How do they get that information, and how do they do that?
Yeah, it's research, right? You said it earlier. It is an industry in of itself. So, unfortunately, there are folks out there now that their daily job is to go do research on people. It's to find, they'll look through social media methods. They might look at your public website. There's other, if you do speaking engagements, they'll crawl agendas and they'll crawl topics for different events, that kind of thing, and they'll find who to talk to. Or really who to target, and they'll start essentially stalking you online, right? They'll go through and it's amazing the amount of information that's publicly available through things like Facebook and LinkedIn, Instagram, et cetera. We can figure out who to talk to, and then once you find somebody on one of the social media sites, it's pretty easy to relate to who their circle of friends are, and typically that's the web. It'll start expanding from there, and they'll build it out.
So, Mike, what should leaders do? I mean, if this happens to their organization, so this ransom thing happens, do they? I mean, look, sometimes we ask rhetorical questions, right, Jeff?
Yep,
so,
yeah, for sure. This sounds like it's going to be one.
This is going to be one. Do they pay the ransom? Is that something you think they should do? Because I think what happens is, you and I have talked about this, is they get this, and the first thing that goes to their head, well, is if I pay it, maybe the problem goes away. But that's not necessarily what happens, right?
Right. And I guess my first advice there would be, don't pay the ransom yourself, right? Don't do it initially. And that's do organizations pay the ransom? Unfortunately, I'd say most organizations now are going to have to pay a ransom to get the data back. That is one of the easiest ways. We hope that you've got backups. Data backups are something that also is not new. We've talked about it for a long time, and we've seen that evolution happen. But some of the newer ransomware now actually targets your backups as well. So it'll render your backups ineffective. In those cases, your course of action really is to pay the ransom. However, there's a process to that. And that's why I would say you yourself should not do it. Engage professionals, right? One of the things that we want to do when we pay a ransom, and we've had clients that have been ready to do this, right? We'll get involved with them on the phone and they're like, hey, we've got the PayPal account set up. We're ready to send the funds. And we don't want you to do that. Engage professionals, because one of the things that we're going to do things like Ofac checks, right? And Ofac is something that typically you'll hear in the banking industry. So why does that apply here? Well, it applies here because what we don't want to do, we don't want to send money overseas and actually fund terrorism or something that is actually a threat to the United States. Right? That can get us into a lot more trouble than paying the ransom itself.
So the federal government and the state government, or states, I should say, both play a role in this to some capacity. Could you just elaborate on that a little bit on how that works?
They do. So there are regulations at the federal level in place for sending money overseas, and there are certain checks that come into play with that. And that's when we send a ransom, that is one of the things we're going to do. We're going to run through a very similar checking process to what a bank is going to do. We're going to check and validate that the person on the other end is not related to terrorism or other financial crimes, again, that may harm the United States. We're going to follow a certain process when we send that wire. One of the other things that we're going to do in that actually doesn't apply at the state or federal level is we're just going to anonymize it. One of the worst things you can do is send money overseas from your own account because you just gave up your own account number, right? So we're going to use a randomly created account number for this specific transaction.
So, Mike, I've heard the term cyber insurance. We talk about different types of insurance that we have as businesses and in our personal lives, et cetera. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that something that actually exists? If it does, what do we kind of need? How does it work? Is this something that our listeners should either have and visit their coverage on it, or B, if they don't have it or not sure, they should look into it? Tell me a little bit about cyber insurance.
Yeah, so cyber insurance is typically it is an additional policy onto your business insurance, and that's it is something that in the digital world that we live in today, typically an organization's most valuable asset really is their data, probably second to their people, and depending on the organization, that's going to depend which order that falls in. So knowing that our digital assets are that important, cyber insurance really should be at the top of every company's list. Cyber insurance protects against cyber attacks, whether it's a phishing attack or it could be a direct targeted attack. We'll hear about nation state sponsored attacks, and that's been some of the big logos that we've seen in the news where they've very specifically gone after an organization that had tried to break in and then typically steal data of some type. But it's going to cover all those different types of attacks, right? We want to make sure that we're protected. One of the things that cyber insurance covers that's very important in those cases is it covers typically the cost of digital forensics, so determining what happened. It covers the cost of remediation. It's going to cover specialization costs in that, and things that we would need specialized skills for would be breach attorney, so breach notification process. Now, every state in the country, so all 50 states have breach notification laws. You're going to get specialized counsel that understands that and can go through the test if we actually need to notify or not in those cases. And that's a critical step. What we don't want to do is miss a step here and ultimately get fined at the end of the day, because insurance isn't going to cover a fine. So they're going to cover those specialized attorneys going through it. They're also going to cover crisis management. And that's something that organizations often don't think about. If I have to notify, and especially the scope of notification, right? So notifying a state that you've had a data breach is a whole different ballgame than if I have to actually notify all of my clients. Once I have to notify all of my clients, having crisis management that can help position the messaging really does become an important aspect as well. And that's one that cyber insurance is gonna walk you through. Typically, it's going to help you navigate that entire process just by having that policy in place. So it's going to cover some of the financial impacts, but they're also going to help navigate the process as well.
But of course, Mike, we don't, I think just like everything else, we need to take the right precautions so we don't go, well, I'm insured, go ahead and steal my stuff, right? I mean, that's not a very good practice. Right. Is this a very expensive coverage relative to, do you know? I mean, if someone said to me, is it costly, or is it, of course, I know how costly it is if you lose your data or don't have access to it, but is this considered a costly insurance, or do you know anything about that at all?
It's typically not all that expensive. So typically it's right in line with any other insurance add-on that you'd add to your business insurance. So obviously industry does matter. If we're in a higher risk industry that's typically regulated, that would put us in a higher risk industry. If we've had previous incidents, that will drive into it as well. And then one of the other things that really does impact cost is what's the overall state of my environment, right? Do I have basic security controls in place today? Things like multi-factor authentication, stuff like that, that will impact your rates as well. But it's not typically very costly unless we don't have some of those things in place or maybe don't have a good track record.
So, Mike, if you had to put a number on small to medium-sized businesses, a percentage that actually had cyber insurance, what would you say that is today?
Statistically, we know it's less than 50%, unfortunately. So, less than 50% of our SMB market is really prepared for this type of attack.
Got it. Okay, good. And, one of the things we talk about here is the topic of business continuity. And I guess in layman's terms, and Jeff kind of just touched on that a little bit, is what that really means is how does my business basically continue the way it's continuing successfully? How do we plan for that? And those things have that topic has gotten a lot of attention lately, especially as it comes to trying to navigate these security threats. So what steps should organizations be taking in a nutshell to assure that their business continuity plans are solid moving forward?
Sure. Yeah. So business continuity has unfortunately had a pretty strong test this year with the global pandemic. So first and foremost, I'd say have a plan, right? That's the starting place. We need to have a plan, and then ultimately we're going to build off of that plan. And how we'll do that is we'll test it. So, by building a business continuity plan and testing it, what we're going to do is first and foremost, business continuity typically is a technology-led thing, right? We do have to test the technology components, but BC or BCP, the business continuity plan, is more than that. It's actually testing the processes themselves that run the business. Can we fail over our process or processes in a failed environment? That failed environment could be due to a cyber attack. So we definitely want to test for that because we know a cyber attack is a reality today. I think a lot of organizations learned this year that, hey, we probably do need to test for a pandemic of some type. Influenza is a very common thing. It happens every year. Some years, it does impact us more than others. So how do we handle our business processes in the environment, or in the case that maybe 25 or 40% of our workforce can't come to work? Natural disasters is another one. We do want to plan for that. We've had a pretty rough couple of weeks, especially up here in the Midwest, from just storms, right? There's been a number of tornadoes that have been impactful and whatnot, and those things do hit our business. What's the likelihood? Typically not very high, but it is something that can happen. So we do want to make sure that we account for a number of different scenarios when we test our business continuity plan. That's something that most organizations or security frameworks out there would say, test your business continuity plan at least once a year and change it up. Test a cyber attack this year and maybe test a natural disaster next year. And then really the most important part of business continuity is making sure that we apply lessons learned. So when we go through and do those tests, or tabletops, as they're commonly referred to, we simulate a disaster. At the end of that, we're going to learn some things. We want to make sure that we apply that back into our business continuity plan going forward so that we don't repeat the same mistakes.
And Mike, that's really good advice. Thank you. Say, being a CEO is a really important job, isn't it, Doug? I mean, it's being your boss and all that kind of stuff.
It's pretty important.
But, but what happens seriously on that, and I've seen this firsthand, and I mean often, they call it spearfishing, and different than we're accustomed to here on our lakes in Minnesota.
Another PH.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, another PH, exactly. And it's really targeting CEOs. And what they're doing is these hackers send an email that kind of looks like it's from me or a CEO, and they're requesting something that leads to a breach. And some of those, they're so sneaky, they're so good, I darn near send a check myself. But and
on behalf of yourself.
On behalf of myself,
right.
to myself.
Right.
No, the point on it is they are so good and so authentic. I mean, it really, you can see how people get tripped up on that. And it's personally has impacted us as a company. When I say impacted, meaning we've had that activity. Fortunately, we haven't taken the actions on it, meaning somebody's followed up and actually sent a wired money or something to that case where it takes it to the nth degree. But tell me about this whole spearfishing thing that executives and companies, are being targeted on, because it really is scary and it really looks real.
Yeah. So we talked earlier about phishing and really the social media research that goes into it. That I think, it goes beyond that with CEO or typically just CXO. We know that the C-suite is generally targeted for this. Again, public websites. We can find a lot just out on the, every organization publishes who their leaders are in the About Us section, right? So we generally have at least a couple of people in a business to target. What these guys will do is we'll target an organization for those specific folks. It's successful. It's hard to do. So what these guys will do is they'll go set up fake domains. They'll maybe change a couple of characters, or they'll very commonly add an S to something, right? So instead of Marco, we'll do Marcos, or character substitution. An RN looks really, really, really close to an M, especially on phones, right? Things that we're using all the time where that text gets really small, it's hard to differentiate. They'll take advantage of that through what they call spoof domains. They're just changing a domain name, and then they'll start sending emails from that. They look authentic. Technology has a very hard time catching that because it's extremely targeted. It's only one or two emails coming into the organization. So we oftentimes, unfortunately, these things are successful. These guys use authentic places to send them. So they'll use things like Microsoft or Google, G Suite typically, to send these types of messages as well. So generally they're trusted. Unfortunately, they're coming from a trusted location.
And I get called back, somebody will call me and say, did you just request a check? Which is a good follow-up, by the way, to physically call the person. And I go, no, why? And boy, they send it to me and I'm thinking, that is authentic. So anyway,
yeah,
real stuff.
That is stuff. And, another thing we're hearing about is, and Mike, we've discussed this, is remediating vulnerabilities. Another fancy term, Jeff, I had to look up in the dictionary. but they don't really have it in the dictionary, so I had to go to the business books. But if you're at home, I think the best way to give you an example of how to remediate a vulnerability is if you're going to go out for a walk, you shut your garage door. That's remediating a vulnerability, just as opposed to just leaving your house open.
It's logical, right?
It's logical, and so this term or phrase has become the focus for many companies. So from a security standpoint, Mike, tell us what that means, and tell us a little bit about what organizations should be doing in this area.
Yeah, so vulnerabilities are just a known exposure, unfortunately, are one of the most common exploited things. It's weaknesses in software and the technology that we use. I think everybody's aware of, whether you use Windows or a Mac, you've had to patch your device at some point. You update the operating system. We've been through that. One of the reasons we do that is to patch and remediate vulnerabilities. It's a very common thing to do, whether we know we're doing it or not. There does need to be attention to this. Again, going back to ransomware and really everything else that we've talked about in this podcast today, goes back to known vulnerability exploits. All those phishing exploits, when ransomware is actually executed in an environment, generally they're taking advantage of a known vulnerability. Recently, the NSA released a list of the 10 most used vulnerabilities in the United States. Most of them were things that were 5 to 7 years old. So that tells us that organizations aren't patching their environment, right? Which is why there's been a strong regulatory focus towards vulnerability management here in the last 6 months. So one of the things that an organization can do to better position themselves is pick one of the security frameworks out there and align yourself to it. Start following it. There's general best practices of things that any business should do. Things like shut your garage door, maybe put a storm door on. We want to put locks on our windows, just basic things that can really keep the environment safe. Follow one of those frameworks. I'd say the 2 most popular ones are NIST, or National Institute of Standards and Technology, CSF, Cybersecurity Framework. That was designed by the Department of Commerce with the target audience of the small business market. The other one that's very common is CIS, or Centers for Internet Security Top 20, or CIS 20, as it's commonly referred to. Both are great frameworks. They're both pretty easy to understand, and they're both applicable to really anybody that runs a business in this country.
Say, Mike, with recent, and it is pretty recent, but boy, it seems like it's been going on forever, this whole COVID effect of people moving home and working remotely. I can't help but think that's introduced potential vulnerability here as it relates to security. Can you tell me a little bit more about, how organizations are exposing themselves, or give me the overview on this whole concept? I work from home now. I really like it. But do the IT departments really like it? I mean, tell me what's going on that front, because that just sounds like there might be a couple garage doors left open.
It's a can of worms, yeah.
It sounds like it, doesn't it? And so, and I know I've been thinking about that myself when we sent about 1,400 workers home. And so tell me a little bit about what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah, work from home absolutely can introduce security challenges. Are we leaving garage doors open? I'd say the answer there is it depends. Hopefully, we're not. And I say hopefully, that means that we need to assess, right? Anytime we're hopeful of something, we have to assess and we have to know what's going on. Ultimately, the work from home environment really does depend about where the data resides and how we're accessing data. So unfortunately, it's not an easy answer for any organization. The answer is going to be different for every organization. I know in our case, we use a lot of software as a service or cloud resources. It doesn't really matter where you reside. You can access those services securely as long as the right controls or measures are put in place to protect them. There are additional considerations with work from home too, though. We do need to go back. One of the things that we saw when everybody was moving their workforce to a work from home environment was a lot of older technologies were put back into place to allow the capacity needs that were required at the time. And those older technologies weren't secure. Right. So we do have to go back and re-secure those things.
So, Mike, question for you on this work from home. I know that like at my home, I've got a security system, which is on a network. Some people are running their different music services and some of these personal items or services that they subscribe to. Is there any vulnerability there, or are those pretty locked down relative to coming in through something I'm using into my work network and back to, compromise our business? Is there any risk on that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a risk on that. That's been a hot topic of late in the security industry. Is the home network environment by nature is significantly less secure or more risky than a corporate environment. Things like potentially your home security system or HVAC controls. Oftentimes, those devices do not get patched or vulnerability remediation does not occur on those devices really at any kind of frequency at all. People just don't do it. So we do know that does introduce more risk. And if you look at some of the largest data breaches that have happened in this country to large Fortune 500 and even 100 organizations, they've happened through those types of systems, HVAC control, camera systems, et cetera. So we know the risk is there. The other risk that is there is that, if I've got other people that are working from home in my same house, right? My wife works for a different organization. What they do for their security potentially puts my business at risk as well, or vice versa, right? So the worst thing that can happen is I get ransomware on maybe my corporate system and it infects another business because it affects my significant other that works in my home environment. Now we just had one organization attack another. But those risks exist, whether it's another business operating in the same home network or it's the home devices themselves.
I think that's a great question that Jeff asked, and I think we glossed over it. But, security assessments, of course, Jeff and I do a really good job of plugging things here on our podcast. And that's something Marco does.
Shameful.
It's so shameful. But anyway, but security assessments are something that are very important. I think it's something that we should be doing. We glossed over that. But the last one that is often missed, yet is super important to maintaining a secure environment, is revolves around training. And I know that, that could be equivalent to going to the dentist for some people too, as getting trained on things, but it's super important in this area. Tell us a little bit about how that's key and how that builds awareness.
Yeah, so training, I think, is the most important aspect of information security. Our users, as we know, are one of the greatest risks. So training them on what to do is very important, and that's I think is probably one of the most missed things from a training perspective, right? We want to train our users what to do in the event that they do get a phishing email, right? So first, we're going to train them in identification, and I think a lot of companies have done a good job of that. We've picked up platforms for that, and if you haven't done that, I'd say that's one of the first things that you should start with. And it goes back to that cyber insurance. One of the common questions that they're going to ask is, do you train your employees on information security? Right? So we want to train them on threats. We know that, but we also want to train them on what to do when something happens. Right? So how we respond to that is really just as important as threat identification, because we know that it's going to happen. Somebody's going to get a phish. They're going to click on it. But what to do at that point? So we're going to educate on that. We want to make training relevant. I'll go back to the dentist analogy. If you go to the dentist and you're not flossing and they educate you on flossing, that's a targeted conversation. They're teaching you, hey, you need to floss or there's going to be consequences to that. It would relate that over into cybersecurity. We're going to train people on why phish protection or that anti-phish conversation is so important, because there's a significant effect to that. So we want to make it relevant as to what the current threats in the industry are. Some cases, it's also going to be what industry your organization's in as well. Gamification is probably the last thing that I touch on there. We know that if we gamify something, so we make it fun, right? We engage the employees. They actually learn more from that. Click on the risky things in this email. That's more effective than just watching a video. All right, so those are some of the things we can do there. And then we're going to follow it up with validation. We're actually going to run tests. We're going to send people phishing like emails from our solution and see who clicks on it. Right. And then from that,
that's embarrassing.
Jeff.
You don't want to be that guy, right? And we know by name when that happens. Okay. Now, Mike, we're going to set Doug straight on this a little bit. How many times, you don't have to have it exactly, but you can, but do I call you and send you copies of emails before? How have I done on that? Give me a letter grade. Remember when I get something,
you're putting him in a tough spot here.
When I get something that looks a little odd, I'd like to think I'm taking my training to heart. I've actually acted on it properly, and I feel like, when you send me back, and a couple of times we've caught something. I know we have, haven't we?
Go ahead, Mike. Give him that suck up grade. Go ahead. What is it?
Right. Yeah. Well, so I'd say I'm a tough grader, but I'd give you an A+ on. You've done a very good job of picking the good stuff out.
It's true, because you know what? You don't want to be that person. Because as soon as you go, well, who let them in? That's the first question I'd have. Who left the door open?
Mike.
They go,
it's going to be on your review, buddy.
Yeah, I know it. So, thanks for the letter grade there, Mike. So we've talked about a lot of things related to a very, very important subject that we always hope happens to somebody else. But just like all insurance and all guidelines that we use to protect ourselves and our businesses, our homes, etc., we cover a lot of things today. And maybe you could just summarize a little bit of all the things that we talked about today, maybe some of for our listeners, a little bit about what the takeaway should be, and maybe even, how Marco might be able to assist him on some of that. And that's the shameless part that Doug usually does, but I thought I'd do it this time too. But tell me a little bit about takeaways and, maybe how we can play a role there for our listeners.
Sure. Yeah, I think the most important takeaway is Doug hit it. Do an assessment, conduct a security assessment, know where you actually stand. We do assessments aligned around the frameworks, and we do that for a reason because it's a really good benchmark. We can typically give you a pretty good idea of how you relate against your peers. We'll give you a roadmap on how to maybe improve your organization's security posture, what things are of risk to your organization, and how we can fix that. Security is a tough conversation. Unfortunately, it comes back, nobody wants to know the ingredients that go into the sausage. They just want the sausage and they want it to taste good, right? So we want to deliver that, and assessment's the best way to get there. Hopefully you go to the dentist, but that's always a tough analogy because not everybody does. Security is one that you'll pay for it in the long run if you don't have a good security focus, and really assessments are the best way to get that.
Very good. Okay, so that's a wrap on security this week, and we certainly request that you follow us or subscribe, certainly both, I suppose, and you don't want to miss an episode. I mean, look how good these are, for Christ's sakes. And in fact, if you think they're good, do us a favor and give us a review, and if it's positive, that would even be better. If it's not, just hold the comments to yourself. So until next time, let's stack.